5, 4, 3, hands on keys, turn. Greetings and felicitations. This is Michael Haspel, and welcome to Quantum Froth Dispatches, episode, I think we're on episode 27, but our numbering system's been always jacked, so who knows. Anyway, we're going to be picking right back up where we left off with our blow-by-blow review of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And when we last left off, Kirk was inspecting the engine room. He decided to cut the inspection short, and he had a little interchange with engineer's mate Peter Preston, who we'll talk about a lot more here in this episode. And then they decided to head off on the cruise. So now you get, we're just going to leap right into this episode the way it is. And we get some very punctuating notes from James Horner's score as the Enterprise model is highlighted sitting in dry dock, and the running lights start turning on, illuminating different parts of the ship, the warp nacelles, the saucer, stuff like that. And then they transition to Kirk and McCoy walking right onto the bridge. Again, we get a lot of this like kind of more military kind of feel. As soon as he walks onto the bridge, Sulu turns around and sees him and says, "Admiral on deck," Admiral on the bridge. So that's something that's routinely done in the service when a superior officer comes on, certainly a flag officer. You would announce it to everybody in the room. On an operational vessel, they wouldn't stop what they were doing. You're just kind of acknowledging that he's there. In a non-operational setting, folks usually stop and come to attention or something. So it's just a nice little nod that things are a little bit more formal, a little bit more military. And what I really like, and this is a piece of background storytelling that, again, just shows, they receive clearance that the Enterprise is ready to depart. You can hear they're talking to some kind of tower. And then there is the voices. You never see these people. The voices of a man and a woman going through a pre-launch checklist. And it's just hovering in the background. And it's one of these things that you probably will never notice and have never noticed unless you're really, really paying attention to the scene. And one of the reasons I've noticed it is because I used to be a launch officer. So it really speaks to me because checklists and everything are your bread and butter in that world. And so you hear them running a countdown, and it's just mundane stuff, but it sounds really cool. And they're saying stuff like, pre-stage flux, chamber, port on. And then you hear somebody say on. Pre-stage flux chamber, starboard, on. Main flux chamber, starboard, enabled. And it's just really, really cool that they're going through this thing. It's not just, it's just not just, hey, Sulu, you forgot the parking brake on. It's serious. You're on a spaceship after all. I mean, it makes a heck of a lot more sense, and it sets the tone that this is serious. This is serious business. Spock, they're cleared for departure. They finish the checklist. Spock kind of turns to Lieutenant Savick and says, "Have you ever piloted a starship out of space dock?" And she says she hasn't. So there's an interesting thing here because Sulu's really the one piloting the ship out of space dock, but there is somewhat of an honor to be the one to give the order, to release moorings, enable thrusters, and then I think she says, impulse power, 1/4 impulse power, and they start to move forward. And you get some really, really cool views of the Enterprise model. This is a studio scale model. It's really, really huge. I was going to talk about the visual effects in this episode, of how they're doing some stuff, and we might get to that in this episode. But if I'm pressed for time, I'm going to skip it and leave it till we get to the Mutara Nebula, because there's a lot of visual effects stuff going on there too. And that might be a better place to have that conversation. We have a lot to talk about today, and I'm a little bit crunched on time. So we'll just have to see how things work. So in any case, the Enterprise is on her way. He tells Sulu to indulge himself, Spock does. They ask what course they should be on, and of course this is a training cruise, so they probably do have an agenda, but it's probably very loose. They don't need to go and be at any certain place anywhere. It's not quite a shakedown cruise. They probably do have some things that they need to check off, but Spock says, "Mr. Sulu, indulge yourself," and it makes me smile because Sulu smiles and then just heads off, but the Enterprise just heads off into space is huge nothingness, So what is he exactly doing when the Enterprise? Well, it brings a smile to my face that maybe those are the orders that people get when you see, like at the beginning of Voyager, where they're like skimming the rings of some planet or something, and they're like pretty dangerously close, you might say, but it looks cool as anything. It's like maybe they just told the helmsman to indulge themselves, and they're like, sweet, We then cut to Regular Station, and it's being hailed by Reliant. And importantly, there's a telling story point here, but it is storytelling that covers kind of some plot holes, but I don't think it's essential to the story. Chekhov says that SETI Alpha 6 checks out, right? And so Reliant's on their way to Regular One to take over Project Genesis. Of course, all the civilian scientists kind of lose it at this, because Reliant's supposed to be helping them, not the other way around, and they're worried that the military is coming to take the ship. And they say that the Chekhov says that the Reliant is 3 days away from Regular One, and that to get ready for them because they're coming to get it. Now there are a couple things that are happening here, and we will cover them. But there's a lot of time compression that goes on in this, where you hear people talking about how far they are from Regular, or how far, and space is huge, right? So you have to kind of figure out these timelines on what things are going on. How compressed is this happening? So they press Chekhov for who directly gave the order from Starfleet to go and seize Genesis, and Chekhov says Admiral Kirk. Right, and so that further incenses David, because we have already gotten hints that he hates Kirk, and Carol is just like, oh, none of this makes any sense, and then they cut off. Now we get into a turbolift scene. Normally I would gloss right over this because there's not a whole lot important that goes on, except that there is in this scene. So this is one of the few scenes where Savik's Romulan heritage is openly acknowledged in the film, and it is still kind of hidden. You have to kind of read into what the characters say. So one of the reasons I like this scene is because in one of the early versions of the script, Savik was going to be after they changed Savik's gender from male to female, Savik was going to be a kind of love interest for Kirk. Now, Kirk is supposed to be pushing 52 here, and Savik is supposed to be, we don't know how old she is in Romulan Vulcan years, but she is a lieutenant, and she's supposed to be extremely young. So that kind of poses some problems, some logistical problems. And I don't know if they willingly changed it in the script, or if they just decided to go, hey, you know what, let's not play it this way, because it is kind of a creepy old man kind of situation. But one of the ideas was that Savik was going to be attracted to Kirk, and then until David came on, and then she's more attracted to kind of a younger version of Kirk. And David's character was a little bit different in that version of the script as well. And I'm really, really glad that they changed that for a number of different reasons. One, it makes the Saavik character way more interesting, that she's not just there just to be Kirk's love interest and kind of competing with Kirk's old flame, Carol Marcus. But it also makes Kirk less of a creep. And of course, we get this whole pop culture image of James Kirk as this womanizer who can't even take his eyes off any women at all. He literally is unable to control himself around women, loses concentration, this kind of frat boy bro image that I hate to say JJ really dialed up to 11. And that is not the case. And one of the things is Kirk has never really messed with members of his own crew. He understands command and why that would turn into a disaster. So we get Kirk and Saavik on this turbo lift, and he notices she's wearing kind of almost like a robe. She's not in uniform. It looks like she's off duty or something, and she's got her hair down. And he makes a comment about, hey, did you change your hairstyle? And she's like, oh, it's still in regulation, right? And then she stops the turbo lift. And Kirk is really perceptive here, but he's behaving as a mentor and as a senior officer speaking to a junior officer. He does kind of play coy, but he's not flirting with her. He's not wanting to answer her question. And he's very perceptive because he's just like, oh, let me guess, you're dissatisfied with your performance in the Kobayashi Maru. And she agrees, and then he's just like, well, it's a test of character. There's no actual solution, right? And he's being coy and kind of smug about it. And she says, may I ask the Admiral how the Admiral passed the test? And he makes a joke and he's like, you may ask. He's not going to tell her that he cheated, right? And he makes a little joke. She kind of changes the subject that humor is a difficult concept for her to grasp. And then, Kirk, when he says you may ask, he restarts the turbo lift because this is not a conversation he wants to have at all. When the turbo lift comes up, it's really funny. McCoy's standing there and he yells at them. He's like, who's been holding up the damn elevator? And it's really funny. Saavik walks between them, right? And kind of acknowledges Dr. McCoy and walks out of the turbo lift, walks between them. And Dr. McCoy walks on there. Now, I thought this was kind of interesting because McCoy is the one who kind of makes a comment about Saavik's appearance. So he says to Kirk, he goes, did she change her hair? And Kirk goes, hadn't noticed, which of course he has noticed. He asked her point blank, so it's kind of a joke. And then McCoy kind of just looks at Kirk, kind of voicing Kirk's thoughts aloud. And we will get to this because this is part of McCoy's role in the Star Trek triangle, in the triad, right? He is the emotion. He is the one who voices things. And he says a kind of, just kind of wonderful stuff, that Romulan ale. And that's all you get, that Saavik is Romulan. That's it. Because otherwise, that line makes absolutely no sense why he would just suddenly be talking about Romulan ale out of the blue in a complete non sequitur. He's not talking about Romulan ale. He's talking about Saavik. And specifically her appearance and probably what Kirk is thinking, but Kirk didn't act on. So I thought that was an important scene, really good storytelling. Again, multiple things going on here. Again, you get the wisdom of age, counseling, youth. This is an ongoing theme in the film. So we get that. Uhura calls at the end of the turbo lift and she's like, hey, you have a call from Regular One. And Kirk's like, I'll take it in my quarters. Who is it? And she's like, Dr. Carol Marcus. And Kirk gets very, very serious. And Bones gets very, very serious. And he makes a crack, And Kirk is very clearly pissed off. And he says, as a doctor, you should know the dangers of reopening old wounds. So we now know that Kirk and Carol have had a relationship, And we knew that beforehand. from what David had said about the Boy Scout comment, that old Boy Scout you used to run with. But now we know that it didn't end well. It didn't end well at all. Obviously, it still affects Kirk. He didn't blow it off. He gets very, very concerned when he hears this. So he's not joking. He's not in a good mood anymore at all. So then we get to this scene, really, really cool scene where, and you have to kind of juggle some timeline stuff, right? Because when would Carol call Kirk? Probably immediately after she got off the comms with Reliant. So and in the movie, it's certainly just minutes have passed, not even 5 minutes have passed between Chekhov saying that they're on their way to Regular One to get Genesis and otherwise, right? So she contacts Kirk. The transmission is terrible. She can't hear Kirk. She can't hear what he's saying, but she keeps saying, "Why are you taking Genesis?" And Kirk is completely baffled. He's just like, what's Genesis? Who's taking Genesis? I have no idea what you're talking about. And she's like, "I can't hear you." And then finally, Uhura comes in and she goes, "Transmission is jammed at the source." So that's a hint there that Khan wasn't 3 days away from Regular One. He's playing a ruse, and there's a number of different things that they do. For instance, we know that Khan and his people are very, very intelligent. We know that they're essentially running the Reliant. They've got Terrell and Chekhov in mind control, but and I don't remember why I know this, but it might be in the novelization or something. They've left the crew of the Reliant on City Alpha 6. And that's what happened to the crew of the Reliant. So Khan's people are running everything on the Reliant. They're running the engine room. They're running everything. So they know how things work. And he's already starting to insert some like fog of war stuff into his operations. And he's jamming Regular One, of course, so they can't call for help. They can't reach anything, but transmission is jammed at the source. So he was not 3 days away. Now, it is conceivable that he might have been between the Enterprise and Regular One. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So at Regular One, we get it's almost in the Dramatica theory, there are these driver quads of storytelling. And there is a faith character who believes in usually the main character, and sometimes they're called the sidekick. And then there's a skeptic character. And in this scene, Carol and David embody those two characters. So Carol is definitely faith. She has faith in Starfleet, faith in Kirk, and she refuses to believe. She's like, there's a mistake. This is just a communication error. And she just refuses to believe that Starfleet is actually coming to get Genesis, right? She's just like, no, this is just a mistake. There's some kind of communication error. There's a breakdown in that. When we get through to Kirk, we'll be able to figure out what's going on. David is the exact opposite. He's always like, no, the military's always used scientists as pawns. They had us develop this thing, and now they're going to come and steal it and use it for a weapon. And there's a little throwaway line on there because you're like, oh, well, why didn't when Khan shows up to Regular One, why didn't Regular One people put up a better resistance? And there is a throwaway line that David says, and he says, they waited until everybody was on leave to do this. So to David, this seems completely orchestrated by Starfleet, and it makes complete sense to him that they're like, look, they waited till we were down to a skeleton crew, and now they're sending a starship to kind of muscle us into giving away Genesis. So Carol kind of, to kind of not have all her eggs in one basket, and in case David is right and she's wrong, she takes some precautions. And so they go, hey, Reliance on the way, what are we going to do? And they go, hey, we're going to move Genesis, get everything ready to go and get your stuff packed. Like, we're going to move stuff. And there's kind of, a coy, again, a TV construct of storytelling where right before the scene break, she has like a little stinger line and they go, well, where are we going to go? And she goes, that's for us to know and Reliant to find out, right? Which is something weird that you would say to coworkers that you all know and work in the same place. You'd just say, we're going to go down to the asteroid, but it is a kind of a TV kind of construct stinger. And she says that, and of course it cuts right away. And we get to Spock's quarters. Kirk has contacted Starfleet, and he's received new orders. They realize there's something going on with Regular One. We get the standard Star Trek trope that the Enterprise is the only ship in the quadrant, which is a little odd because you'd be like, well, wait a minute. Starfleet would have known that Reliant was also, at the beck and call of Regular One. And so they probably would have tried to contact Reliant first and said, oh, hey, wait a minute. We lost contact with Regular One. Contact the Reliant. Well, of course, Khan's not going to answer Starfleet. So they've lost contact with Regular One and the Reliant, and they're sending the Enterprise to investigate. That's what's going on. And Kirk comes in, and he's like talking to Spock about how good are these cadets? This is really serious. We're going on an actual mission now. The training cruise is over. How are they going to act under pressure? And Spock kind of gives them a wishy-washy answer, in their own manner, each in their own way or something. And then he just anticipates that Kirk's going to assume command. Now, you get a lot of symmetry and a lot of repetition in this movie. And I think that's one of the reasons why audiences adore it and why it still works to this day. We get repetition of the theme, right? That Kirk in his own thoughts is missing out on a life, that he could have taken, the life that he passed by to be the commander of the Enterprise. And Spock is playing his role as the reason character, the reason part of that triangle among the characters, right? So he's going to also tell what Kirk needs to hear and what Kirk has already come to his conclusions, but he may not believe it himself. He needs to hear it from an external source. And Spock is that source, and he's going to tell him from the point of view of reason. And he says, it was a mistake for you to accept promotion. Commanding your starship is your first best destiny. Kirk already knows this deep down. That's why he's kind of just, going through the motions as Admiral. He should have never accepted promotion. Now he's riding a desk. He's been promoted beyond what he's best at. And he knows this, but he's fooled himself. And as McCoy talked about before, he's hiding behind rules and regulations. And he's kind of just saying, hey, we all have our assigned duties. I knew what I was getting into, and I knew that I couldn't stay commander of the Enterprise forever, but that's where he's actually the best Kirk that he can be, is as commander of the Enterprise. And actually Starfleet promoting him is a disservice to all of Starfleet, not just to Kirk. So they have this whole thing where where Spock yields command to him and says, go ahead and take it. Kirk kind of is coy. He understands he doesn't want to take command from Spock because it would be kind of an insult to his friend. But Spock's like, I have no ego to bruise. You're the best commander on here. You're also the senior officer. There's precedent and it's logical, and they kind of make a joke about, Kirk saying, I wouldn't presume to debate you. And Spock's like, that would be wise, because you're going to lose. So that's kind of funny. And then Nicholas Meyer plants the other big theme. And this is not a theme for Kirk or for Khan or whatever. It is actually the main theme of Star Trek II. And I probably don't even have to tell you this. You already know what it is. It's the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. And that is from a philosophy called utilitarianism that John Stuart Mill popularized it. I don't think he actually started it, but I think he popularized it. And that's essentially the core of the philosophy, that if you're looking for what constitutes a moral action, you have to look at the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. That's one of the tenets of utilitarianism. And then he drops this line that we're going to hear again. And the way Leonard Nimoy delivers this line here is in complete contrast to the way he delivers it later. And that's why the later scene works, is actually because of the way he does it here. He says, essentially, I have been and always shall be your friend. He doesn't quite say that exact line. He says something like, we've been friends, and, you've been my friend, and I have been and always shall be yours. And he says it in a very Vulcan-like manner where he's just stating a fact. And, of course, that line is going to come back. And, again, this is Nicholas Meyer establishing synergy. It's almost like he's creating a nostalgia effect within the same film. Because you've heard these lines before, you've heard people say these before, you remember the good times or the bad times or whatever, and it works. And of course, he's reminding people why these emotions that you're going to have in this movie are earned. And it's because this relationship has been going on for a long time. It matters. It's not something that's just casual that they throw in there for, just because it's a plot point. And they got to tick off they have to tick off a checklist that, hey, this has to happen. So Kirk assumes command. We get, he gives a speech to the whole ship saying, hey, we're taking command. We're going to go, there's something wrong with Regula. We're going to go check it out and investigate. And when he's saying that, though, there's, again, this kind of military, this is a naval vessel. This is not just a spaceship that's just traipsing along at the whims of its captain. There are rules, there are regulations, and this is going to come back and haunt people, right? So he says things like, duty officer, so note in the ship's log, right? He's like, I'm assuming command, duty officer, so note in the ship's log. It's a throwaway line, but it shows that there is an order, and it's grooming the audience to understand, and I'm going to say this again, how things work on a starship, because it's actually really important. And then we cut away from that, he to Reliant, right? And Reliant, interestingly enough, one of Khan's first mate at this point, Joaquin, and I may mess up his name because he's Joaquin in the film or Joaquim in Space Seed. And his name does change, and I don't remember which one is which. So I may use Joaquin and Joaquim interchangeably. But he announces that they are intercepting the Enterprise. So they know where the Enterprise is, probably through some kind of long-range sensors or probably through some status board that Starfleet has not, it's in between ships, so they can go, oh, who's in this quadrant? Oh, the Enterprise is there, right? And so they've been monitoring what's been going on. So they've been tapped into communications. They know what's going on. And he says, plans to intercept the Enterprise. We're on course to intercept the Enterprise. And then Joaquim makes a plea for sanity. And this actor, I'm sure he's been in a ton of stuff. But if you want to see something that's so 1980s, like it literally cannot be beat, go check out The Phoenix. Just go to YouTube and look up The Phoenix. I think it did come out in 1982. There were maybe 5 or 6 episodes. I think it used to come on the air after Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of, and I could be completely wrong about that, but that's kind of how I remember it. And it was this show, it was basically like made by the same people that made The Incredible Hulk. And it was the standard kind of show where this guy goes around and helps people, and he has his own ongoing story, and he's being pursued by a reporter or something like that. It's the same kind of formulaic show. But he's like some alien, human hybrid, and there's a ton of ancient astronaut stuff and everything. And I have no idea how the show holds up because I have not been able to find an entire episode. But the intro to the Phoenix is on YouTube, and it is worth a watch. It's kind of very funny. But to jump back to Star Trek II, Joaquin makes a plea for sanity. And he says, look, we've got a starship. You escaped from Ceti Alpha 6. You've proved your superior intellect. You're better than James Kirk, right? We can go anywhere we want. I mean, and to the observant, Terrell and Chekhov are just kind of standing off to the background, like just standing there like statues. But he's like, we can go anywhere we want. We've got a starship. They can't stop us. We can do whatever we want. And tellingly, Khan responds with a quote from Moby Dick. Now, you have to understand, Khan might be the smartest of them and the best leader, but all these folks are eugenically gifted. They're all as smart as he is. So, and they've been stuck on Ceti Alpha 6. So they've read all the books that they have. You know, they've read everything that they had multiple times. So it's not like he's just throwing this quote out. He is telling Joaquin exactly what he plans to do. And he quotes Moby Dick, and they changed it a little bit, so it's not the exact quote, but he's like, he tasks me and I shall have him, you know? And they changed a couple of things around where he's going to chase him around the moons of Nibia and around the Antares maelstrom instead of what's actually in Moby Dick. But it's a very recognizable quote. It's one of the most famous quotes from Moby Dick. And so Joaquin would have known that, he's gone full Ahab, right? And if you know Moby Dick, you know how it ends. I mean, the crew gets essentially wiped out except for Ishmael, and everybody dies. So sorry for the Moby Dick spoiler, but it's not good for the crew. So if you're on the ship and under command by Ahab, is not a good thing. So Joaquin would have known that, right? And then he ends the thing saying, hey, prepare to alter course. So he's changed his mind about something, right? And they were on their way to intercept the Enterprise, and now he changes the course. He's like, prepare to alter course, right? And then we switch back. And there's a comment that we're back on the bridge of the Enterprise. Now, keep in mind, when they filmed this, it's very, very odd because they filmed this kind of in a vacuum. So the Enterprise bridge is the Reliant bridge. It's the same set, just kind of slightly redressed. So when they're bouncing back and forth, these scenes are obviously not filmed at the same time. They were filmed, like a month apart. And what's really incredible is, especially when Kirk is speaking to Khan, and vice versa, and you see the passion and emotion that Khan is using to converse and threaten with Kirk, that just is a testament to Ricardo Montalban and to William Shatner and their acting abilities. Because when William Shatner is reacting to Khan, or when Khan is reacting to Kirk, they're not hearing Ricardo Montalban and William Shatner. They're hearing a script girl who is standing off camera and reading the lines deadpan. And then they're emoting to a wall because there's no view screen. There's nothing there. So it just makes me appreciate their performances all the more. And folks like to take shots at Shatner and say that he's overacting and everything like that. And I'm going to come to his defense saying that this guy is really, really accomplished. He's really good. And the big scenes where he's overacting, there's actually a reason for it. And we will cover that when we get to it. But we're going to jump back. We get a phrase that starts to bring in the scale of things again. Somebody says that Enterprise is 12 hours and 43 minutes away from a regular one. And the last speed that we had gotten was when Kirk ordered Sulu to go to course to regular one, warp 5. So at warp 5, they're still 12 hours away. We know that Reliant was somewhere around Regula because they could jam the station. And we're going to learn more about it because we're going to know that they've actually kind of been to Regula. And so they get this kind of answer that there is no contact from Regula 1. We get this kind of really famous quote. I used to use it as my answering machine message for a while, where Spock says there are two possibilities. They are unwilling to respond. They are unable to respond, right? And so Kirk goes, hey, well, I need advice. And Spock goes, well, it would help if I knew what Genesis was beyond a biblical reference. And so they decide, okay, we're going to go down to Kirk's quarters and do some research on Genesis. But then Kirk says, have Dr. McCoy meet us, right? And I know I've been promising to talk about this, so this is where we talk about this. Why would he have McCoy, who's a medical officer, join him in his quarters when he's going to review a top secret science experiment? Spock is well qualified as a scientist to evaluate what Genesis is and counsel Kirk. So why is McCoy there? And it comes down to a storytelling technique and theory. So I mentioned the Dramatica theory before. The Dramatica theory had an interesting view of story. They say that a complete story is, they call it the story mind. And they go, a complete story is a model of a mind trying to resolve a problem, a given problem. So that's why Kirk needs McCoy there. He needs his complete mind to solve the problem. And there is something called this, and people refer to it as the Star Trek triangle. It is not unique to Star Trek. It is all over drama. It is a dramatic construct that's used all over the place, and it's because human beings are wired for story. So we're going to tell stories the way we understand them best. And so I'm going to talk about it in the terms of Star Trek because this is a really easy way for us to analyze it, since one of the characters is literally logic personified. So it works. But it is not unique to Star Trek, and it's sometimes called the Freudian trio, where we were talking about the id, the ego, the superego, and it shows up over and over again in a lot of really good stories. And it is an easy shorthand if you're a storyteller to fall back on these because your audience is instantly going to know on a subconscious level what you're doing and what's going on. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there need to be three people, even though I call it a triumvirate, a triangle, or whatever. You'll kind of see as we talk about it. But I'm talking about Star Trek, but it's also everywhere else. So I'll bring up like Harry Potter, right? So we've got Harry, Ron, and Hermione. And in Star Trek, we've got Kirk as it's sometimes referred to as the hand, the head, and the heart. Because the hand takes action, the head kind of judges things, the heart kind of wants you to do things, but without the hand, they can't do anything. So that's kind of the reason why it's called the hand, the head, and the heart. And so you've got Harry Potter, who is the hand, he's kind of the action component. You've got Ron, who's the emotion. You've got Hermione, who's reason. In Buffy, you've got Buffy, who's the hand. You've got Xander. You've got Willow, right? Star Wars, right? We're talking about the hero's journey and falling back on things. Star Wars is a really good example. And it's a really good example of a triangle, a triumvirate that doesn't have three people. And the reason that is because Han and Chewie come as an item, right? You don't really get Han Solo without Chewbacca. It's Han and Chewie. They're always together. They are really, in essence, one character. One character of which can only vocalize in raw emotion. Chewie. He can't speak. People still understand what he has to say. Why? Because people still understand emotion. And Han also embodies the skeptic, right? So you can see how some characters can embody multiple different parts of these archetypes that are used in storytelling. So we've got Han and Chewie as emotion, we've got Leia as reason, logic, intellect, and then Luke is the hand, right? He's the one that has to make things happen. So, and the way it breaks down in Star Trek is that Spock becomes, like, if we're going to take it in a Freudian way, Spock is the superego, McCoy is the id, and Kirk is the ego. And these are standard, like I said, we're hardwired to understand stories, so these are standard archetypes. And Jung broke them down further. If you want to read about that, read The Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler. And he, you can break it down even further and analyze everything in ways of Jungian archetypes, and it'll show you how you can deconstruct these stories so that you can reconstruct them when you're telling your own stories. Another example it's a little bit looser because we really have two big heroes in the triangle, but there's a reason in the Lord of the Rings, once they get free of the Fellowship, right? When they get rid of the Fellowship, and it's no accident they have 8 people. They have 9, right? But you can combine, in the Fellowship of the Ring, you can combine Merry and Pippin. They're basically the same person. So they changed later, right? But in Fellowship of the Ring, Merry and Pippin are the same person. So really you have 8, and there's a reason why you have 8. There's 2 driver quads that are going on as far as the characters go. And you can actually map all these archetypes directly onto all the people in the Fellowship of the Ring. So in that, once you get to the 2 towers, there's a reason why Sam and Frodo are going on alone. Gollum shows up, right? And it's like you kind of have Sam as the reason, you have Frodo as the hand, and Gollum as emotion. And there's, again, really 4 people in that quad because Gollum is 2 people. So it's Smeagol and Gollum, So it's just kind of, it's really interesting once you kind of see these things that you can break them down. And more importantly, if you don't understand this, like, you should know the rules when you tell a story and only break them when you're confident enough it'll work. When you start changing up things that the audience already knows and is expecting and knows how it works, you risk breaking the story. And we'll leave it at that and jump back in. I'll probably come back and talk about that in depth at some future podcast, because I can do an entire podcast on that, on studying the archetypes of the different stories. So we're back in Kirk's quarters. They show how serious it is because he has to identify for a retina scan before they'll even show him the Genesis stuff. And we get the first CGI scene, full CGI scene in a motion picture. And it is this kind of government Starfleet educational video type thing introduced by Carol Marcus that shows this footage of talking about stage 1 of Genesis, stage 2 of Genesis, and stage 3. And they talk about stage 3 on a planetary scale. They show the Genesis device, they show it impact, and then you get this computer CG rendering of this planet, this moon being formed. It is a little bit dangerous to tell us to unveil details like this. It's what folks refer to as a data dump, because you're literally watching this little mini film that only lasts maybe about 2 minutes, but you're watching this mini film within a film. And it's a data dump, just kind of, if you do it in stories, it tends to take people out of the story. So that's why it's dangerous to do that. But it works in this case because you're kind of looking over Kirk's shoulder, and Kirk, Spock, and McCoy also don't know anything. So and Myers keeps it really, really short. He keeps it short. They're just dumping the data that you need for the story to go on. Nothing extraneous. It's just, here's what you need to know. An interesting side note on this is that the ILM division that made that video, that was mostly, I want to say it was fractal-based CGI, the ILM division that made that wound up being bought out by, I want to say Steve Jobs, and it became Pixar. So it's just kind of that that's kind of cool, but it also, at the end of the video, when it's showing this like kind of foreign planet in orbit, Carol says, when one regards the cosmic problems of population and food supply. And you're like, hey, wait a minute. This is a world this is a universe that has replicators. What are you talking about food supply? As long as you can convert matter to energy and energy to matter, you've got kind of unlimited food, as long as you've got matter to put in the replicator. And then she talks about population. So these are just a couple of limiting factors that show that maybe the world of Star Trek isn't, again, as idealistic. Well, it's certainly idealistic, but it's maybe not as utopian as we believe, and there might not be as many Class M planets around as we're led to believe. Like, these things might be a lot rarer than you believe, or that we've been told, and that's why they've got these starships rolling around looking for any Class M planet they can find. And certainly, if you can just start creating planets, that's really, really unbalancing to the state of everything. So, of course, other interests would be really involved, and that's why it's very classified. So we get into this great debate between Spock, Kirk, and McCoy, right? And when you watch this debate, Spock, again, reason, logic, and he is breaking down Genesis. He's like, oh, this is how it would work. This is what it would do. And McCoy is immediately 100% emotion. He's the one shouting, right, in the room. So Spock, he's like, what? McCoy asks the question, what do you suppose would happen if this thing was used where life already existed? And then Spock says, well, it would replace existing life in favor of its new matrix. And McCoy is literally offended by that. He's just like, it's new matrix. We're talking about universal Armageddon. Like, he's taking things hyperbolic immediately. He uses one of his favorite insults against Spock, which is not an insult. McCoy uses it as an insult, but it's fact. He goes, you're green-blooded inhuman. Well, yes, like, that is Spock. He is not human, and he is in fact green-blooded. But it's just kind of funny that they're kind of bantering back and forth, and this is one of these things that influence stuff. And you'll note that Kirk doesn't talk during this debate. Kirk is not part of the debate. He doesn't have an opinion. He doesn't side with anybody. Why? Because he's the judge. He's the ego. He has to listen to the superego and the id battle it out and then decide on what to do. And as a quick side note again, and man, I almost kind of don't want to talk about this, but I do. There is a phenomenon in fan fiction called slash fiction, and it usually involves either a homoerotic or homosexual pairing between two characters. And it doesn't always have to be homosexual, but the way it started was that. And it's because people picked up on this kind of triangle, the triumvirate, the Trek triangle. They picked up on that. And so they would code the fan fiction so that you would know it'd be Kirk / Spock or Kirk / McCoy. And that's where the term /fic comes from. It actually comes from like Star Trek fanfic. So now we've got two things to thank Star Trek fanfic for. That's where Mary Sue comes from. If you remember, we had that conversation, and also /fiction. So it's just kind of a funny side note, and I don't know why it popped into my head right then, but it is a part of Trek, and it definitely fits in with the Star Trek triumvirate, the Star Trek triad. So, we get back. Kirk is the judge. They're trying to figure out what's going on. And then Uhura breaks in. And she goes, vessel in our area closing fast. And Kirk goes, well, kind of what is it? And she answers, it's one of ours, sir. It's Reliant. And man, this is, to me, this is my favorite part of the movie. This is just phenomenal. So it's not further elaborated on, but both ships would have had to drop out of warp. So They kind of drop out of warp. They don't talk about that, though. Kirk just gets on the bridge, and this is Kirk's Kobayashi Maru. And the way Nicholas Meyer shoots this entire scene is very much that. It's very much very in the moment, very same, almost the same camera angles, but I'm kind of reaching there because you're on the bridge set. There's only a given number of camera angles you can use, but he shoots things very much the same way as he did in the Kobayashi Maru because he's subconsciously wanting the audience to realize how serious this is, and we've seen this before, and it is serious. We get cuts back and forth between the Enterprise and the Reliant. And I want to take a brief aside here to talk about how some folks point out that the ships on Star Trek are always right side up whenever they meet one another, right? And they see that as a plot hole. And there's a really easy explanation to that. It's that the helmsmen, being people, are always going to orient their ship to the other ship. So it's best. The reason they would do that is it would present the best shield facings, the best weapons arcs, all that stuff. And it's like if you think about like other science fiction that uses 3D stuff, it's like Ender's Game, perfect way. The enemy gate is down. You need a point of reference. So they're going to orient the ships to one another. That's why the ships are always right side up. Also, the way that they're moving, these are very much ships of the line. They're on the same plane. Enterprise is not coming in from above Reliant. They're on the same two-dimensional plane because they are ships of the line. This is Horatio Hornblower in space. They're not trying to change anything or do anything avant-garde. And if you want to see a really different contrast to that, check out The Expanse because they do things pretty incredible when it comes to space battles. And it's very different than Star Trek because The Expanse is not trying to be Horatio Hornblower in space. It's trying to be completely different science fiction. So we get different cuts back and forth between the Enterprise and the Reliant. And when we do that, James Horner's score introduces the leitmotifs for each ship. So that you'll understand, oh, this is the Enterprise theme, this is the Reliant theme, and they're going to use that throughout the rest of the movie. Also, this is where youth tries to correct age, and Savick says, hey, remember General Order 12, whenever we're talking to it, and actually Spock shuts her down, not Kirk. And he says something like, the Admiral's well aware of regulations. But that also implies Savick would have raised shields at this moment, and she did in the Kobayashi Maru. We've seen Savick do the right thing before. Kirk noticeably doesn't do the right thing. He doesn't raise shields. So that's the audience. That automatically puts the audience on the edge of their seat, on tension. We now know that Kirk is doing things wrong. Not only do we know that Kirk is doing things wrong, from a storytelling perspective, Savick just told him he was doing things wrong. So now the entire audience knows that. So we're on the edge of our seat. We're tense. We're just like, oh no, because we know Khan's on the Reliant. They don't know that, right? We get Khan quoting a Klingon proverb. Some folks have pointed out that this is a plot hole because Khan wouldn't have known about Klingons. I'd say no. When they left him on Ceti Alpha 6, I mean, they gave him access to all their manuals, ship's manuals and everything when he was on board, right? And that kind of bit him in the butt. But they're not going to just leave him on Ceti Alpha 6 with nothing. They're going to give him, reading materials, survival handbooks, stuff like that and everything. And that's almost certainly where he read the Klingon proverb that revenge is a dish best served cold. And Montalban delivers the line beautifully. And also we get another artifact of the ships of the line kind of combat, right? These ships are right on top of one another. They would not be. Space is huge. You're talking about, if you look at the technical manuals, the phasers and photon torpedoes have ranges of, tens of thousands of kilometers. So the space battle would be taken at much bigger distances. Of course, when we start talking about the visual effects, and I'm not going to cover it in this episode, I'm realizing the time that I have, and I'm not going to get to it in this episode. But when I talk about how they're going to do these visual effects, that also plays into why the ships are the way they are. It is also an artifact of television, an artifact of film, that they want to see both ships on the screen at the same time. But what's interesting, if you think back to the TOS show, a lot of times when they engaged alien vessels, you did not see the alien vessel because it was like 20,000 kilometers away, and they were engaging it. They were firing photon torpedoes. Interestingly enough, there's another side note. This is one of the few times you actually see in the films these starships fire phasers at one another. Most of the time, they only use photon torpedoes. And there's kind of a rumor that the reason they did that was because ILM didn't want Star Wars conflated with Star Trek, and so they didn't want the laser beams and phaser beams look similar. And I don't buy that. I just there's probably a different reason for it. Probably because when you do phasers or lasers at the time, you had to use rotoscoping technology, which means you're hand drawing that stuff onto frames of film, and it is time intensive. Whereas photon torpedo, you could just film a separate element and layer it in there on the optical printer. So that's my guess as to why they don't use phasers. But in this movie, they actually do. Kirk finally declares yellow alert, and there's something else that happens here. Savick says energize defense fields. So we don't know if that's actually part of yellow alert or if she was taking initiative to actually not quite countermand Kirk's order, but kind of taking an action in between raising the shields and energizing these defense fields, leaving everything down, right? She raises these defense fields. We see them go up, and there's some great inserts. And this is a key part of what I was talking about when I said that Nicholas Meyer uses these inserts that you see, these cutaways that I have never seen in other Star Trek shows. When she says energize defense fields, we see people actually, and we don't know who these people are. They're other crew people, but we see them actually turning switches and turning knobs and taking action, and it's cutting very, very quickly. All these actions are on scene for maybe a second. That's it. But we get to see like a screen, and it shows that the defense fields are right around the bridge. And that's where the defense fields are that basically explain why they didn't get killed. And another quick aside, folks also talk about starship design and why it's built the way that they're built. And they say that the bridge is kind of in a terrible place because it's on the top of the dish. It's literally the center of a bullseye. You can just blow it away, right? Well, when we see the defense fields come up, we notice that they cover just the bridge. So it makes sense that if the shield generator, that there's a shield generator like right there. And that might be why the bridges are where they are. We know that the nacelles are where they are so that if there's an imbalance, first of all, they need to be balanced to create the warp envelope. But if there's an imbalance, they can be ejected away from the ship. And on some of the smaller ships, obviously, like Defiant, those are not incorporated because if it goes, you're kind of done. But we see the keys being hit, and they actually say things. They're not just, if you freeze frame, you can read where it says like warp power transfer, field generator, shield activate. They actually have labels and everything, and it's really, really cool. So Reliant tries to buy time so that they can get closer, right? Well, why do they need to get this close? Well, because maybe Khan's people, while they know how to make things work on a starship, they're not really good at it. They're not very proficient. They've had a couple of days at most to figure out how to work all these things. So they just want to be right on top of the Enterprise so the Enterprise cannot get away, and they won't miss. So Spock sees through it, and when they realize that they're lying, they go ahead and Reliant locks phasers. Spock sees that they're locking phasers. Kirk does give the command to raise shields, but it is way too late. He gives the command essentially as Khan opens fire. he hits them in the engineering session primarily. Sulu can't get power. We get the scene, where Kirk opens channels to Mr. Scott. What's interesting side note here is that when he opens engineering, you hear all the chaos going on there, right? You hear the entire thing, and Kirk kind of yells at Uhura. He's like, "Uhura, turn off that damn noise." And she answers, Mr. Scott on discreet. It's this really little thing that doesn't matter. You could have gotten away with it not having it in the scene, but it makes complete sense. It adds a sense of realism. We now have Scotty is trying to talk to Kirk, and he says exactly what he told Saavik in the Kobayashi Maru. The main Energize is out. So we've already heard this before. We're like, oh no, the last time this happened, the entire crew died. This is really, really bad. So when they get to the damage report, they're just like, Spock says they knew exactly where to hit us. Well, of course, they've been studying all the manuals and everything to know exactly how to defeat it. And then Reliant signals that they want the Enterprise to surrender. So Kirk is like, do it while we still have time, because he has options. The more time he has, the more options he has. So he opens channels, and we get a really good piece of acting from William Shatner when he sees Khan for the first time. And he's like kind of stunned, and then he's like, Khan. And I absolutely adore Ricardo Montalban's kind of response to that, because it's almost super friendly. He's like, Kirk, you still remember? I cannot help but be touched. And it's just the way he says it. It's just like simultaneously, wow, what a jerk. But at the same time, the way he acts it is just absolutely perfect. And again, we have to remember these folks are acting to a wall, to a script girl who is reading the lines deadpan when you want to appreciate their acting and everything. So it is actually really, really cool. So Kirk shows why he's a hero here, because very clearly Khan decides that he's like, well, I'm going to take, I've made my meaning plain. I've deprived your ship of power. And when I swing around, I mean to deprive you of your life. And so Kirk immediately is like, hey, if it's me you want, spare my ship and my crew. I'll have myself beamed aboard. So he is a hero, he's not this like selfish monster. He is a valiant hero, and he's like, okay, this is my responsibility, this is my fault, and it's caught up to me, and all these other people don't have to die because of what I've done. So Khan agrees to his terms if he turns over all material regarding the project called Genesis. Now, Kirk has some bad acting here. He goes, Genesis, what's that? Now, notice I said Kirk, not Shatner, because Shatner is playing Kirk, who's acting poorly. Right? That's what's going on in that scene. But and of course Khan sees right through it. He's like, don't insult my intelligence. I know you know what it is. And then Kirk goes about doing his own thing, and we get a punctuation of, again, age and wisdom against youth and inexperience. So he and Spock are on the same page immediately. They're like, the prefix code, and he's like, it's all we've got. So then they start looking things up. Saavik is asking, what is the prefix code? What is this? And this is a good storytelling method of using somebody new and inexperienced to give vital information to the audience, exposition, right? And Kirk is able to explain to the audience through Saavik what is the prefix code and what they're trying to do. What is the sneaky thing, right, that they're trying to do? Well, and it works extremely well, and it works way better than the kind of as you know scene, right? And as you know, Star Trek is really, really bad about it, and especially in the Next Generation. You'll have Riker tell Picard certain things like, as you know, the transporters don't work if the shields are up. Well, of course, the captain would know something like that, right? And by having a new character there, you can describe the scene in the story, in a storytelling manner. You can just give the audience information they need and avoid the as you know scene, right? And it makes a heck of a lot more sense because these characters would know that. And of course, the characters that do know that, they don't need to explain it to one another. Kirk just goes, hey, call up Reliance Command Console. And Spock immediately says the prefix code. And Kirk's like, it's all we've got. Like, there's no exposition. We don't even know what it is until Saavik asks, I don't understand. And then Kirk uses the line that I've been reusing this whole time. You need to learn how things work on a starship, right? And then he says, we're going to use Reliant. We're going to use our console to order Reliant to lower her shields. Now, when they do that, they get ready. Sulu locks phasers. He gets told to lock phasers. A lot of folks point out this is another plot hole because Spock noticed that Reliant was locking phasers when they did that to the Enterprise. Well, Spock was scanning the Reliant actively. He was looking in his science station, looking at the scans of the Reliant. So he saw them lock phasers. On Reliant, no one's looking at anything. They're looking at the view screen and looking at Kirk because they're arrogant and they think that they've won. So that's not a plot hole. That's just storytelling. That's just the way it is. Khan's crew is more inexperienced. So that's also why they don't notice it. And there's a great moment where they kind of show the inexperience of Khan in a storytelling visual director's moment that is absolutely brilliant because it puts the audience right there. And you see Joaquin, he's manning the tactical station, I believe it is, and he's like, hey, our shields are dropping. All of a sudden, he's like freaking out, right? Oh, our shields are going down. Khan looks at him, he's like, raise them. And Joaquin doesn't know what to do. And he's like, I can't. And Khan goes, where's the override? The override, right? Because he knows there is an override, but he doesn't know where it is. Nicholas Meyer then jumps into Khan's point of view. We get a POV shot for maybe about 2 seconds of the entire helm and command consoles of the Reliant. And it is literally just a mass of blinking lights and jumbled buttons. And if you don't know exactly what you're looking for, you're not going to find it in the 2 seconds you have before Enterprise opens fire. And it is a great little moment because he shows you what Khan sees. And you're just like, oh yeah, there's no way he's finding the override unless you exactly know what it is. What's interesting about the console too is you get a really good look at some of the arrays of buttons that are on there, and they're buttons from an accordion, if I remember right. And there's like a different colored button in the center of each one, and it's so the characters, because one of the art designers realized that the characters would turn away from their consoles and still have their hands on the console, and they were still doing things. Right? But they would be turning away from the console to deliver lines. So she thought, well, how are they doing this? Well, it's like touch typing, right? They have like a central button that tells you where all the other buttons are in relation to that central button, and they don't have to look at the keys. They're professionals. They know what they're doing. They don't need to look at the keys. They just need to have their hands on the keyboard, and they know, they're touch typing, essentially. So Kirk immediately has Sulu target. He doesn't give this order, right? So Sulu already inherently knows what to do because he's a captain himself, right? Keep in mind, we have 3 captains here. We have an admiral, the Captain Kirk, in charge of the Enterprise. We have Captain Spock. We have Captain Sulu at the helm, right? So Sulu already knows exactly what to do. Kirk doesn't have to tell him. He hits the fire control and the warp drive. So Reliant's immediately crippled. She can't go anywhere. Right? She's stuck in that quadrant. Enterprise is also stuck there. We get Joaquin saying, when Khan wants to go back and fight, and Joaquin's like, no, we have to withdraw. Like, we're hurt. We have to withdraw. And Joaquin also confirms that Enterprise is not going anywhere. They're stuck in that area, right? And this is where a little bit of, I want to say it kind of doesn't make as much sense because at most, Enterprise is now, when Enterprise encounters Reliant, they're still maybe 10 hours away at Warp 5 from Regular 1. We don't know how much time has passed. but they're not at regular one. They're definitely not there. So trying to get there on impulse engines is a stretch. So my guess is that at some point, both Reliant and Enterprise repaired some manner of warp drive, right? Otherwise, they're not getting anywhere because space is really, really huge. But the movie doesn't talk about that. It doesn't acknowledge it. I'm just bringing it up because it is something to be aware of. It makes it seem like they're right there, that they're right there at Regula, and they're not. They're not. they're in deep space. So that's an interesting thing. When the Reliant retreats, James Horner's theme almost takes a Jaws-like theme when they go away. It's almost like Jaws is now swimming back into the depths of the ocean, and Reliant is going away. The threat is going away, and he uses this very Jaws-like theme. Of course, Jaws came out in 1975. Everybody in the audience for Star Trek II would have subconsciously understood the Jaws theme and understood exactly what that meant. And the way he plays it, when you watch that scene, it's totally Jaws. Kirk, Sulu congratulates him. He's like, hey, you did it. And Kirk immediately chastises himself. He says, I did nothing. I got caught with my britches down. I must be going senile. And then he turns to Savick and says, you go right on quoting regulations. Right? So again, we get this whole age versus youth thing. Another quick aside, when they're talking about the prefix code, to reinforce the age versus youth thing, Kirk has to put on his glasses. Because if you remember, he can't see, he couldn't read the book. So he can't see what's on the console, and he's trying to use the buttons and trying to go through this procedure. And Spock even corrects him on the procedure because it's not something that's used very often. Spock points out like one of the buttons to hit. And he has to wear his glasses, and he even says, damn, because he's getting old. So it's this old age versus youth thing. Again, another theme. And then, it looks like everything is cool. And then to remind you that there were consequences to Kirk not following regulations, the bridge door opens and Scotty emerges, and he's holding Peter Preston. And Peter Preston's in a bad way. He's really, really messed up. And everyone kind of reacts, even Spock. You get Uhura gasps out loud. Savick has a facial grimace reaction that she makes. Even Spock reacts. He closes his eyes. He's like, oh no, right? Because these are all cadets, and a lot of them just died because Kirk didn't follow a regulation that he should have, right? Again, in headcanon, court-martial offense for James Kirk right there. And one of many, right? So it's, again, just reinforcing that. Folks have asked, why did Scotty come to the bridge? If you look at the technical manuals, there is like an express turbo lift that goes from engineering to the bridge. And in theory, it could be, and we get to see this later when Kirk comes back from Regula, that a lot of the turbo lifts are not working. They're having to take access ladders. So if Scotty needed to get to sickbay, the easiest way for him to do it would be to take the express turbo lift to the bridge and then take the bridge's turbo lift back down to sickbay. And that is exactly what he's doing. And to close this out, there's a scene in the novelization, I believe, where we get some more inkling of Savick's Romulan heritage. She is so upset as to what happened to Peter Preston because she was tutoring him. And Peter had kind of a crush on Savick. And she kind of looked at it as, oh, isn't it cute? But she was tutoring him, and now he's died, or he's dying. We get to see his death scene the next episode. But she goes into a conference room and just tears it apart, destroys it, because she's strong, like Vulcans are. So she just destroys it, tears it apart, showing that she doesn't have a grasp on her emotions. Alas, that scene is not in the film. We don't even get a reference to anything about Peter Preston and Savick at all. So we're going to have to leave it there. So will Kirk discover what happened to Genesis? Will Khan get his revenge on Kirk? What about Regular One and Chekhov and Terrell? All this and more on the next episode of QFD. This is Mike, out. You have been listening to Quantum Froth Dispatches by Michael Haspel. Music and other cues are provided by The Fat Rat. The song you're hearing is Monody, featuring Laura Brehm. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit www.patreon.com/QFD. Thank you for listening, and we now return you to your mundane reality.